So, Professor Koji Bohanek, I'd like to call you to the stage and we can get started with our next panel on yoga studies. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Dr. Miller. And yeah, as Dr. Miller just said, this is our yoga studies panel. We have two really interesting looking papers here that I'm looking forward to hearing. One is a panelist, Saathvik Devarakonda, whose paper is entitled Alluri Sitarama Raju and Yoga Under Colonial Violence. He's going to go ahead and present first. He's one of our graduate students with a master's degree in engaged Jain studies with us here at Claremont School of Theology, but he's also a philosopher, and I really know him well from his work there. And he's got a master's degree in philosophy from University of Delhi. Okay, so let's welcome Saathvik, and go ahead, Saathvik.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction, Professor Ji. Let me share my tab. I hope this is visible to everyone. Is it?
Yeah, it looks good. Looks good.
Perfect. So, first of all, Jai Janendra, Namaste, and a very good morning, everyone who is present here. I'm Saathvik Devarakonda, and I'll be presenting my research on a very interesting theme that I sort of endeavored to work on during Professor Miller's inspiring course on social justice and modern yoga, which is on colonial violence, Alluri Sitarama Raju, and yoga under colonial violence. So before anything, let me get to introducing the character, the protagonist of my story. So as you can see, on the 7th May of 1924, British forces tied this man called Alluri Sitarama Raju to a tree in the forests of Eastern Ghats and shot him to death. That is such a tragedy. And you're looking at a 1986 commemorative stamp. Um, of him, which is one of the few visual records that we have of him. So why are we discussing him? The reason is not many of us might have known about him before, but if you have watched this 2022 movie called RRR or Triple R, which won an Academy Award at the Oscars for Best Song Natu Natu, you might recognize this character through a fictional tale told by a Telugu director. But at the same time, what I am interested in is not the pop culture engagement around Alluri Sitarama Raju, or not that he was a freedom fighter, but as to what kind of commemoration we might have of him, which might justfully present an aspect of him which could be useful to us in the contemporary times, the times in which we live in, especially as he was a yoga practitioner. We wouldn't find anywhere in contemporary yoga discourse. There's hardly any mention of this revolutionary leader who spent 5 years in intensive yogic training as a Bala sannyasi or a young renunciate before taking up arms to defend Adivasi communities or the tribal communities of modern Andhra from the colonial dispossession. So today I want to ask, why has the warrior yogi been completely, or at least been rarely mentioned or erased from yoga's history? And second of all, I'd like to investigate into how this connects to Mambe's theory of necropolitics. So, without wasting any time further, let me dive straight into his short biography. So, you might see two pictures here down here. First is my my source of investigation. My method here is historical ethnographic. So because I couldn't really get down to where Alluri Sitaramaraju actually conducted his rebellion or to the places, because the interesting point is the current government or the governments, the state governments post independence in Andhra have still continued to displace tribals from there, and it has been in controversy throughout. So an ethnographic study in person wouldn't have been possible even if I went down there. But at the same time, through this book by Padala Ramarao in 1950s, which is historically closer to Alluri Sitaram Raju's times, has been a very interesting source for me to delve into the kind of person he was and the kind of practices he undertook. So Alluri Sitaram Raju was born in 1897 or 98. There's a dispute on dating in Vishakhapatnam district, which comes in the southern western coast of India in Andhra Pradesh state. He was born into a Kshatriya family. In the Indian caste system, Kshatriyas were basically the warrior class people who had yogic inclinations during youth, and is said to have carried a Telugu version of the Bhagavad Gita along with him wherever he used to go, and had basic Sanskrit knowledge according to a few sources. and an exposure to vernacular Telugu literature and commentaries. And he's said to have followed a Saathvik diet. He was a vegetarian, and he also followed abstinence. Though it is mentioned that he undertook different practices under gurus and drew from multiple local traditions, these gurus have remained unknown because of those missing 5 years in his life. So, Padala notes in his biography that Balyamunundi Alluri Sitarama Raju, uh, Alluri Ramaraju సాధనలో ఆసక్తి కలిగి ఉండి యోగ సాధనలో ఆసక్తి కలిగి ఉండి తెలుగు భగవద్గీత యొక్క ఆ, తాళపత్ర గ్రంథమును ఆ, ఎల్లప్పుడూ తన వద్దనే ఉంచుకునేవాడు, which means from childhood itself Alluri Sitaramaraju was very interested in the yogic practices, and he went on to keep a Telugu version of the Bhagavad Gita with him throughout. And the second verse which I quote is about him taking sattvic food and practicing pranayama in his daily life. And this other picture you see here is at the institution where Alluri Sitaramaraju pursued his secondary schooling. And this is kind of personal because my maternal grandfather retired as the principal of this institution. He served there for 32 years as a professor of history. And you can see a tiny 15-year-old me standing in front of that building in January 2020. So moving forward, comes to surface his years as a Bala Sannyasi. So he's said to be an intensive renunciate, and during his period of yogic training, and it can be said that he was practicing some form of old hatha yoga, such as breath control, pranayama, physical endurance, and bodily discipline. And he developed he in a lot of narratives he's said to have developed remarkable physical capabilities, such as long distance walking through difficult terrains, enduring harsh conditions, maintaining focus under extended stress, because he was always a target of the British colonial forces for the kind of revolutions that for the kind of revolution that he was bringing up. And he's said to have always been wearing ochre robes or gerwa of a sannyasi, which is a visible marker of renunciation. And he practiced oriented service, not just, I mean, his practice was not just personal or spiritual attainment, but it was rather a collective idea of yoga. So the critical idea here is that yogic discipline was some kind of a preparation that he might have undertook for his revolutionary resistance, and not separate from his political consciousness. And the disciplined body is a political body, as one can understand from his methods. So, during his lifetime, he entered the Rampa agency, which is near the East Godavari district of Andhra Pradesh, and lived with Koya, Valmiki, and Kond people, who were marginalized tribal people, often exploited. And Alluri is said to have rejected caste hierarchies, though he wore a sacred thread, a Yajnopavita, which is a marker of someone who is a twice born in Indian traditions. And some narratives also mention that he occasionally even wore the tribal dresses, and he was the one who introduced the method of guerrilla warfare in this part of Andhra Pradesh, especially to fight the British forces, because he believed that peaceful methods weren't productive anymore. It's not that I'm promoting violence through this presentation, but it is just a historical fact that he went through violence. And he learned tribal languages, shared food with them, and participated in their ceremonies. And he's been given the title Manyam Virudu, which means hero of the jungles, or comrade, and not a savior, of course. So, and during his armed resistance, he was once ambushed by the British forces, and he was put to death on 7th of May 1924. But what is interesting is his main motive, or his main rebellion, was against the British Forest Dispossession Act, which was instituted between 1922 to 1924 to have more forest material for the sake of trade, and so they were further expanding into the forests. And he believed that self-defense was necessary after exhausting peaceful means, as I've said. And he targeted symbols of colonial state power, not civilians, of course. So, moving forward, this is where I'd like to bring in the concept of necropolitics, as Vamve would point. So, Eshel Vamve theorizes necropolitics as sovereign's power to exercise, sovereign's power is exercised to dictate who may live and who must die. And this is what was happening during the British colonial period in India. And the 1882 Madras Forest Act can be seen as a necropolitical instrument because it prohibited podu, which is shifting cultivation, and it also prohibited collecting forest produce and things like hunting. And the act determined which populations would access means of life and which would face what. And this is what Rob Nixon might call slow violence, starvation, displacement, cultural annihilation, uh, accumulating over time rather than a spectacular massacre at once. So it is some form of slow violence or slow death. And British classified Adivasi lands as reserved forests. And these people had been original inhabitants of the land for, I think, centuries. And all of this for commercial timber extraction. And this is what can be called legibility projects, rendering complex indigenous land use systems invisible to make territories amenable to extraction. So when communities resisted, the response was brutal. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, sexual violence was weaponized. These were technologies of population management. And Adivasi or tribal lives were constructed as disposable, as surplus to colonial economic projects. And the current situation of what Alluri fought against has been no different post independence. The necropolitical logic hasn't ended. Uh, if you see the first point of the card sequence, first of all, there has been a Polavaram Dam project at the very place, at the very Rampa agency where Alluri fought against the colonial forces, where 85,000 families have been displaced, over 400,000 individuals, more than half were scheduled tribes who originally had to be protected by the Indian constitution. 371 villages were submerged. Families moved to resettlement colonies and where they cannot practice traditional livelihoods, and they receive inadequate compensation that does not account for forest resources or cultural significance. And you cannot value tradition with money again. And as you can see in the second box, the 2006 Forest Rights Act by the government of India was supposed to correct historical injustices. Instead, 5,227 square kilometers in Andhra Pradesh remain in legal limbo after 18 years. The 2022 forest conservation rules gutted consent provisions. So 6,721 Gutikoya refugee families, which are indigenous tribes, were displaced by earlier counterinsurgency, and they remain unrecognized and existing in necropolitical abandonment. And third, there was an Operation Kagar which was carried out from January to May of 2024, when 92 people were killed, which was a state authorized killing, which was described by the authorities as Adivasis and Maoists, especially people who were targeted to be either leftist extremists or Maoists. And unfortunately, a few civilians sort of had to take bullets and lose lives, such as the 6-month-old Mangli Sodhi, who was shot while nursing, a 12-year-old deaf mute Kamili killed. This conflation renders entire tribal populations suspect, constructing them as what Agamben might call homoseka, bare life that may be killed without it counting as murder. So the same regions, same communities, same necropolitical structure and logic. The language might have changed. Now we call it development instead of civilizing. And Maoists have replaced the bandit tag that Alluri used to carry. But the logic determining whose lives matter persists. And this is where I'd like to point out a very important aspect of why Alluri is relevant to whatever is happening here, which is the warrior-yogi tradition. I would love to posit that Alluri was sort of bringing out this whole idea of um, what Pinch might call a warrior yogi in his work Warrior Ascetics and Indian Empires in 2006. You can see a picture here of Parashurama, a warrior ascetic archetype from the Hindu tradition. And William Pinch's meticulous historical research documents that armed militant yogis were absolutely central to Indian history from 16th century through 19th centuries, where they were not passive contemplatives. There's nothing wrong in being passive contemplatives, but these people were organized military forces, such as akhadas, that hired themselves as mercenaries, controlled trade routes, asserted sovereignty through force. Yet, contemporary yoga seems to have neglected such lineages in popular discourse, and yoga is constructed as necessarily non-violent, apolitical, oriented towards individual wellness, which mostly resonates with the popular Brahminical readings or the pure Yoga Sutra narratives, if I may. So the warrior yogi necessarily becomes non-violent, apolitical, and oriented towards individual wellness. Again, I'm not justifying violence. I'm just trying to do some ethnography here. So Alluri represents, in my opinion, the continuation of one of such traditions, or at least some tradition of this sort, into the anti-colonial movement. A biopolitics of self-determining, refusing necropolitical power, as Bembe would call it. This matters because it reveals that yoga's current depoliticization is not natural or inevitable. It's a result of active choices about whose practices count, whose histories matter, and who gets to define authentic yoga. And this is where I'd like to come to the idea of double erasure. As I said, Alluri was not killed once, but twice. So Alluri has been erased two times, or probably three times, as I could just posit it. First is from the colonial records, which framed him as a bandit, fanatic dacoit. His yoga appeared to be dangerous mysticism, evidence of irrationality, and secondly, post independence, where he was recuperated as a freedom fighter, a status erected, and buildings named after him. But his nationalist memory sanitizes the radical content, and he becomes a patriot fighting for the nation, and definitely a revolutionary, but not a revolutionary aligned with tribal sovereignty necessarily, against any state right to their lands. His yoga is depoliticized, reduced to personality trait, giving him courage, and not some idea of collective liberation, as he might have possibly put it. And thirdly, modern yoga, where he's completely absent, at least in to my eye. So, despite extensive documentation, which unfortunately again only happened in the Telugu language, and there have been very less number of works in the English language which have covered Alluri's biography or anything about him. So, Alluri appears nowhere in yoga teacher trainings or academic programs or popular literature for his idea of um, subject as freedom or some sort of collective liberation, not in the soteriological sense again, but yeah. Now I need to briefly address what I had mentioned in the beginning, which is the 2022 film Triple R, which won an Oscar and brought Alluri's name to unprecedented global audience. So the film does not include visual markers necessarily throughout, except for the climax portion. But I don't want to give you a spoiler, where he wears ochre robes and has been has underwent meditative practices. There was this one teaser which was released, the shots of which were not in the movie, where he's shown to be meditating and all. It's called Bhim for Ramaraju, where another character introduces Alluri Sitarama Raju, or Ramaraju's character. The film does not. And I want to be clear: RRR deserves appreciation for elevating Telugu cinema globally, and including these elements where it could have omitted them entirely. However, the fictional friendship framework between two revolutionaries of the same time, because their histories went missing in the same period, and some sort of mythological Rama parallels, ultimately lack space to properly develop the warrior yogi identity, or even to reflect upon such an idea. So, in the paper, I analyze this in detail, but for time, I'll simply note that RRR creates an opportunity for a deeper engagement. But audience searching after the film need to discover the historical warrior yogi and not just a cinematic spectacle. And to answer why the broader eraser question, I would like to mention four functions. Firstly, it maintains yoga's marketability to middle class consumers seeking wellness, not revolution. So if tomorrow if I say I want to be a part of some revolution, my parents might not conform to the idea completely. And as Godrej might note in his neoliberal yogi and politics of yoga, I mean, same thing. And it preserves Brahminical control. Alluri allied with Adivasis and not Brahmin elite. So this renders yoga safe for elite consumption, to not have such people in the very framework. And centering Patanjali Yoga Sutras privileges Brahminical philosophy over subaltern embodied practices. So, again, this is not probably, I mean, it might also be an oversight, but it need not be an oversight completely. It could also be a form of active suppression from one lens. So, Alluri's example does not fit the narrative of contemporary yoga institutions, as they may wish to tell. And finally, understanding the difference between liberation versus neoliberal wellness. If you see in the left column, I'd like to mention that Michael Foucault theorized biopower as states management of populations, shaping bodies, regulating life, optimizing productivity in his The History of Sexualities, Volume 1. And modern neoliberal yoga often functions as biopower. We discipline our bodies to become better workers, manage stress to remain productive, optimize health to reduce healthcare costs. Individual wellness is important, personal journey is important, and it is all in a political practice. There's nothing wrong with it, but it is a very restricted picture. That is what I'd like to point out, as other scholars have as well. Whereas if you look at Alluri's warrior yogi practice, it represents something fundamentally different. There is a biopolitics of liberation, collective resistance, preparation to confront state power, not to submit to it, service to communities facing dispossession, refusal of necropolitical sovereignty, and fundamentally political practice. It can be confidently asserted after reading his biographies that his yoga was definitely political. And contemporary Adivasi communities facing displacement are Alluri's political descendants, and unfortunately, their struggles continue the resistance he embodied. The families being displaced by the Polavaram Dam project, which has been started at the East Godavari region, and the communities facing Operation Kagar and other similar atrocities. They're fighting the same necropolitical structure using different tactics appropriate to the context and probably more peaceful methods. Recovering the suppressed histories like Alluri's is essential for justice in these contexts, not to promote violence, but to understand the spirit, to understand virtues such as standing against oppressive authority and courage, and both in historical and contemporary contexts. So again, I ask, what's at stake? Let me close with what is ultimately at stake. Alluri Sitarama Raju lived, fought, and died as a warrior yogi. Recognizing this identity does several crucial things. It challenges modern yoga's depoliticization, forcing us to ask what yoga's revolutionary potential might be when it is not serving elite consumption and capitalist productivity. Secondly, it illuminates structural continuities. The necropolitical violence against Adivasi communities did not end with independence. It continues through a different mechanism using a different language. As I said, development against civilizing projects. And it validates contemporary resistance as legitimate, not criminal. Of course, I wouldn't again promote any violent ways, especially when communities resist displacement. They're defending their right to exist, just as Alluri did for them. And it opens conceptual space for thinking about embodied practices differently, not as escapes from politics, but as integral to political commitment, not as individual wellness routine, but as preparation for confronting injustice. Both recognitions, in my opinion, are necessary, both historical and contemporary, for justice to become possible. And thank you so much. This is where I'd like to rest it. I would love to welcome questions later. And this is my selected bibliography if any of you might be interested. Thank you so much for bearing with me.